Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Muir. I'm going to be your master of ceremonies for the next hour and 15 minutes, doing the first of our ISO 20022 Standards Forum sessions. Before we start with the content, just a few things I wanted to cover. First, as Chris said, there's nothing the standards community likes more than a party. And we're going to have one tomorrow at 4:30. If you don't already have your invitations, or if you don't already have it in your calendars, please fix that as soon as this session is over. Your invitation is waiting for you at the reception desk. Another thing that you're going to pick up from the reception desk, I would strongly recommend, is this wonderful miniature container, which has details on all of the fascinating and exciting Standards Forum sessions that you can participate in over the next 4 days. It's easy to read, it's easy to digest, and it's on paper, which is an endangered species, as you know. Finally, those of you who have iPads, please raise your hands. That's quite a lot of people. Keep your hands up, please. Keep your hands up now if your iPad does not have the ISO 20022 adoption map on it. You almost all have it. That's fantastic. For all of you who don't, please pick up one of these from the reception desk, and it'll explain how to get it. Really good information on all of the 71 market infrastructures and communities who are at some stage of rolling out an ISO 20022 system. 71. It's an amazing number, considering where ISO 20022 was just 10 years ago. And we're here to give it a performance appraisal. A performance appraisal, for me, has 3 essential components. The first is, of course, a natural and objective look at whether ISO 20022 is doing what it was originally intended to do. So a historic look at its performance. Second, it's important to look at the future and motivate ISO 20022 and its actors to do even better over the next 10 years. And that also gives us a chance to reset its objectives. Third, and very much vital, it needs a benchmark. It needs a vision. It needs something to aspire to. And in order to give you some sense of what we should be aspiring to, we've invited Professor Joanne Yates from the MIT Sloan School of Management to introduce to us the concept of another ISO standard, the container, and how the container standardization brought about. Well, don't let me steal her thunder. Joanne, why don't you come and share your experiences with us? Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Joanne Yates.
Hi. Ooh, that's loud. So I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm particularly excited by the fact that there is a container right there, actually 2 of them right there. I don't usually get to talk so close to a prop that's that appropriate. I've been studying the history of industrial standards for the past several years. Oops. Fine, good. It is loud. There. Okay. So I've been studying industrial standards for quite a while, and I'm hoping that some of the story that I can tell you about the container will be relevant for the ISO 20022 story as well. So, learning from the shipping container is what we're going to be doing. And the theme for what I'm going to be talking about is how it helped create the infrastructure for global trade, which is something that I think is very much part of the ISO 20022 as well. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why shipping containers and how they were standardized, and then what effect they had on the global economy. So to start with, why standard containers? So before the war, World War II, pretty much every ship hold was filled with bundles, assorted bundles, 200,000 of them per ship usually, of all different sizes and shapes. So longshoremen had to figure out how to get them in, how to get them out. It was really inefficient and really expensive. So after World War II, there started to be a growing interest in what can we do to make it more efficient and more effective, to get rid of some of the theft that went on and to actually get things on and off ships more rapidly. The U.S. military sort of started the movement by creating Connex boxes that they used to ship weapons and supplies around the world, and they also used to ship officers' families' goods around the world. I know this because my husband was a military brat, and his family's goods were shipped in these Connex boxes again and again. The proprietary systems, though, also began to evolve at this point. In the 50s, two particular companies, shipping companies, developed their own proprietary systems. Matson was on the was on the West Coast, and it was taking things from California to Hawaii, and it developed a proprietary 24-foot box container that it would go from truck into the ship and then back to a truck at the other end. The same thing on the East Coast, Sealand developed a 35-foot container. And again, it was to go from truck to sea and back again. But what they were doing is they were saving the money on trucking transportation by putting the truck body onto the ship, sailing it up the East Coast, taking it back off and putting it back on a truck, and it turned out that was a lot cheaper shipping. So we had these two companies out there, one with 35-foot containers and one with 24-foot containers, and they were both using them within their own little proprietary system, and it was actually making money for them. It was more efficient and it was making money, but it lacked a lot. To realize the real benefit, a growing number of people realized that you needed to have it not just in a single firm, but crossing firms. And you needed to have it not just in a single transportation mode, but in several. So they wanted it to be able to go from ship to truck to railroad. And it needed to be able to go seamlessly across that. To do that, you really needed standard containers. You couldn't have variation. So next step of this is how containers were standardized. You can see our container right there. The U.S. started this process off because the two companies who had sort of pioneered it were in the U.S. And they had made its advantages well enough known that the American Standards Association, which is the predecessor of ANSI, decided that, okay, it was time. In 1957, it set up a committee to start looking at how they could standardize these containers. And because they were a voluntary consensus standard-setting body, like the ISO, they felt that you had to have a broad participation by all the stakeholders. You couldn't just have one stakeholder. So even though the shipping companies were the major players at that moment, they wanted broad participation across trucking, railroads, shipping, the manufacturers of all of those, the manufacturers of the boxes, the manufacturers of the equipment that picked them up and put them onto ships. All of those players had to be part of it. So they argued and argued and argued, as is the process in there, because the point is to get to a consensus that everyone can live with and will be the best for the largest number of players in the industry. And they ultimately decided on a 40-foot maximum length, which was how long in the U.S. Railroad cars were allowed to be at that point. And then they took 10, 20, and 30 to add up various combinations to equal that 40-foot one. But you'll notice that the 40-foot is not 35 feet, which is what Sealand has, and it's not 24 feet, which is what Matson had. So neither of the incumbents in the shipping industry won on this one. They lost. The length was not what they would have preferred, but the whole point of this standardization process was to come up with what was best for everyone, for the widest set of stakeholders in the process. So they reached an agreement by 1961 on the links and also the cross-section, which was 8 by 8 then, 8 feet by 8 feet at that point. They reached this agreement, and although the actual standard, the US standard, the American standard was not issued till 1965, everyone pretty much treated that length as the correct length starting in 61. At about the same time, the international community got started on it. So now ISO got into the act. They decided that they would set up a committee in 1961, and from 1961 to 1967, they were working on this same problem. The international standard for containers came out in 1970, but they had pretty much settled it by 67. And ISO Technical Committee 104 was the committee that was in charge of this. And it accepted, actually, the ASA-approved set of links, although they added 2 other series to it, trying to pull in. There was one that was popular in Russia that they pulled in, and one that was a European local rail standard that they pulled in. Those weren't finally, though, made part of the ultimate standard. They ended up fading away just because no one used them. So they had gotten to the end of this process, but the really interesting part happened at this point. After they settled on the links, they still had to figure out how to hold them together at the corners. I don't know that you can see them on there, but there are these corner fittings. Do I have a picture? Yes, corner fittings by which the equipment picks them up and puts them from one mode to another. And that was the subject of a huge battle, both in the US and in ISO. And part of the argument was that intellectual property, there were patents involved in various ways. And at this point, neither the ISO committee nor the American committee wanted to put something into that standard that had intellectual property attached. They didn't want to have it be the case that users of the standard would have to pay to be able to use those corner fittings. Oops, got too far there, didn't I? Sorry. So Sealand actually was one of the ones who had patented it, and it was the company with the 35-foot containers. It had lost on that, but it still agreed, and this is an example of standard setting, voluntary consensus standard setting at its best. They agreed to give up their intellectual property so that this process could continue and so that an agreement could be reached, and they did reach that final agreement. Now, it wasn't universal. There still were some other alternatives. These are called swap bodies, and they're used in continental Europe just for train and truck. They're not as strong. They're lighter weight and not as strong as the ones that have to go to sea. The ones, when you go to sea, it has to be a lot stronger and withstand a lot more forces. So these were not as strong, cheaper to make, therefore, and a little wider so pallets would fit onto them. So developing countries took a while to adopt them as well. So this was not a rapid process. And there are some other non-standard ones, but all that to the side, 90-some% of all containers at this point were ISO standards. And it had a huge effect. The immediate effect was on the shipping side. 93% reduction in the cost of loading and unloading, so a huge cost reduction. And the time of ship and port, instead of having a ship 3 weeks sitting in the port being loaded or unloaded, now it was 3 days to turn around. So it made a huge impact and allowed the mode changes. But this is the really interesting story. This graph is the world trade, the growth in world trade in deflated dollars. And you'll see that between those 2 red dotted lines, that's when containers were being adopted. So you could see that at the same time that containers were being adopted, there was a huge increase in world trade. So for years, for decades, there's been this ongoing argument among economists about, was that really the cause of the growth in trade or not? Because other people said, no, it's policy stuff. It's the GATT, it's free trade, it's this, it's that. So there was a lot of argument about that. These 3 authors, Bernhofen, El-Sali, and Neller, have finally come up with an econometric technique that allows them to get at this. The paper isn't even published yet. It's in the way through the system. But what they learned in using this this panel data, pairwise panel data from pairs of countries, is that 500% increase in world trade is attributable over a 15-year period to the containers in north-north trade. If you look at all the trade, it's 370%. What that indicates is that the growth wasn't as big for north-south and south-south as it was for north-north, but it still was positive. And the effects of containers were greater than that of the GATT. They could actually look at that, and it was roughly 100% the GATT was responsible for roughly 100% cumulative increase in the same 15-year period as you got the 500% in the north-north trade. So they also found that when they were used intermodally, not just on ships, but intermodally going back and forth, that's when they had the greatest effect. So you have these ports where you have a port with the shipping and then also the railroad attached. So the basic story then is that it revolutionized world trade. It wasn't just that. It's a huge quantitative difference, but it also made a huge qualitative difference. Without that, I mean, it really moved the economy from being primarily regional to being primarily global. So it had a huge effect. And one of its effects, I think, can now follows on with the ISO 2022. It increased financial flows because now you have to pay for all that trade. So I think this is sort of the preliminary story. While it's a parallel on one level, it's also something that feeds into the next revolution in standards, which is the ISO 20022. So thank you.
Joanne, thanks very much indeed. Okay, so that's the benchmark, a standard that can enable a massive increase, not only in the quantity of business that we do between our countries and our institutions, but the quality of that business with efficiency gains alongside it. That's a big ask. So when we were doing our background research and homework for this session, we were looking around for people we could talk to who were at the really at the start of the genesis of what became ISO 20022 at Swift. And I found a man called Frank van Dam. Sadly, Frank can't be with us today, but as one of the original architects of this form of industrializing standards, and certainly the man responsible for making those concepts come alive at Swift, I was able to interview him remotely, and we have an extract from that interview for you right now. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank van Dam. ISO 20022 is appreciated best in figures. One model, 10 years, 70 initiatives, hundreds of message definitions, thousands of users, millions of exchanges on and off the Swift network, and incalculable value. That's probably the best introduction to ISO 20022 that anybody could come up with at the moment. But Frank van Dam, one of Swift's original pioneers working at the very earliest stages of ISO 20022, give us a quick introduction to yourself. Who is Frank van Dam, and what was he 10 years ago?
Well, 10 years ago I was at Swift. I was working in the standards department. I was responsible for the technological part of standards, and that's how I got involved into ISO 20022. My background has always been in the IT business. I moved to Swift in '95. And then pretty quickly got into the standards department exactly because we wanted to get some more automation. And in fact, ISO 20022 is just coming out of this automation.
Could you start perhaps by describing that context in which you were operating at the time? So this is between, say, 1995 and when ISO 20022 first really hit the streets. There was quite a lot of stuff happening, both in the financial services world and in the world of standards and in the world of automation. Can you describe that context?
Sure. When I came in, I came in a very manual world. In fact, standards were made using Word. and that was about the only tool that was used to do it. So there was a goal to get some more automation, to have some more quality as well, because it was error prone. It was quite a work to make the user handbook, for instance, that we had to do a lot of revisions to make sure that there were no errors in there. We had to describe everything from a technical point of view as well. There was quite some misinterpretation. So there were various reasons why this could and should be improved. And we also got feedback from the community that they wanted to have something with more quality, something with more automation possibilities, something that would help them to have better straight-through processing, to have less costs in their development, because standards was considered as something quite expensive. So that is where we first got started looking into how can we automate a bit of what we have today. And at that point, there was no idea of even of XML. XML did not exist at that time. It started, in fact, as a standards initiative. A bit later, the Swift Next Generation project started, and that had an impact because just like the rest of Swift, we wanted to have a kind of next generation of standards. There were also a lot of other initiatives in the financial world that were popping up, lots of other standards initiatives. So there were quite some questions of why are all these initiatives coming up. And one of the reasons, I believe, is that Swift at that time, with its standards, was not totally up to speed or up to the possibilities that the technology offered at that time. So that is how we got involved in it. There was also work going on, for instance, in the EDIFACT world, the UNC-FACT world. And with all these contacts, we slowly got into the direction of ISO 20022 to start developing a new methodology on how to create standards, to look at how can we describe it in a more structured and usable way for IT purposes. And so bit by bit, the story of ISO 20022 came alive.
It was a really interesting period, wasn't it? The end of the 20th century was marked by a technology boom and an interest in things technical that I think was more or less unprecedented, especially in the data world. And sure enough, what you've said, I think probably means a lot to the audience here about how ISO 20022 and its modelling approach addresses some of the inconsistencies that are inevitable in a manual standards development orientation. But can you expand a little bit on how you sell ISO 20022 and its approach to a business audience? What is the business problem to which ISO 20022 is the solution?
The business problem is that you want to support your end-to-end business. And business does not start with a bank or end with a bank. It goes beyond that. It has a whole approach of the end-to-end transaction, starting often in the corporate world and ending in the corporate world. So in order to support this whole end-to-end process, you need to consider everything that is happening. You need to consider the business that people are trying to do, that companies are trying to do. You have to understand what information they need. You have to understand what will happen once the information gets out of the bank. You need to understand why that information is coming into the bank. So all of that needs to be captured in order to have a good idea of how you should support this business. So the idea of ISO 20022 is to have a better support of the business by understanding the end-to-end transaction and by building something that fits nicely into whatever happens before and whatever happens later in the transaction chain. And for instance, if you look at the repository, which is, I believe, the heart of ISO 20022, there you find a lot of information of description of what kind of information is used in the business, what does it mean, how should it be used, what are the rules around it, how does it fit in various different parts of the business while there is still commonality. And all of that, I believe that there the advantage or the main benefits for the business are that you get a standard, or that's at least the idea, you need to get a standard that supports your business in the best possible way.
So if I can paraphrase you, ISO 20022 is essentially a way of bringing the entire community involved in the end-to-end transaction into not only the world of using messages, as Swift would used to characterize this, but in the development and maintenance of the repository, which supports this end-to-end view of a transaction.
Yes, and I think that it's very important that the business people need to be involved, and not just the people that are directly involved with Swift, but that is where ISO 20022 goes beyond Swift. It's something that is part of the community. I think it's very important that the community takes ownership and that they very precisely define what kind of information they need, how it needs to evolve, when it's important, which parts are important, which parts can be left out, because it must also be pragmatic, it must be usable, it must bring benefits to everybody who uses the standard. So for me, taking ownership is an important thing for the community, so that they get involved, and indeed the community is the end-to-end community, including everybody who has something to do with the financial world, directly or even indirectly. Because you need a good understanding of what is happening in the business and why the business is happening in order to have a correct model of what you need, even if you would look only at what you need between the banks.
I really enjoyed that. I'm sorry. Anyway. The full interview can be made available to you afterwards. All you need to do is to drop your business card into one of the mini containers, which is on your little wooden stools dotted around the audience. We'll make sure you get a copy of it. Okay, so this is where we start getting interactive. The Standards Forum is, after all, a forum where business and standardization meet. We want you to help us with this next stage, if possible. And that is, of course, the performance appraisal of ISO 20022 in the first place. Another ingredient of a successful performance appraisal is an HR department. I will be an HR person, and I'm going to be joined by two others. James Whittle is the director of the UK Payments Council and the convener of the ISO 20022 RMG. And he is kindly offered to be my co-moderator for this session. And the other representative of the ISO 20022 HR team is Malene McMahon, who's going to be capturing the key questions, comments, feedback items, and calls to action that we and the panel managed to identify over the course of this next session. And without further ado, let me introduce you to our review panel, the people who are going to be giving ISO 20022 its 360 review. If we can have the panel slide up, please. Let me first welcome Carla McKenna from Citi, and of course from the overall ISO TC68 governance body. Carla McKenna from Citi. Wouter van Sandvliet, who runs and is the Chief Information Officer of Intix, which uses heavily the ISO 20022 model and similar techniques for data analysis of both on-the-fly and archived material. Fiona Hamilton from Volante Technologies, who is the EMEA Chief Operations Person. Hans Tesselaar from the Banking Industry Architecture Network. Hans, where are you? Hans will join us shortly.
He's run away.
Neil Buchan from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and of course from the Payments Market Practice Group, which spent a lot of time earlier today talking about its program of work. Siegfried von der Au from the Deutsche Bundesbank, who is head of the department looking after the projects Target 2 for securities and Target 2, which obviously has a heavy usage of ISO 20022 involved. Roland Boeuf, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Swiss Euro Clearing Bank. Ray Kanachiku from JASDEC. And Stephen Lindsay, of course, from Swift. And our final panelist, our special guest, Jamie Shea, who was, in fact, responsible for the genesis of ISO 20022 when she was the head of standards at Swift at the time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel.
So we've heard about containers, and I think with containers is you can actually look, see, feel it, probably even kick it, although that would probably hurt. The idea of this session is to bring 2002 to life and make sure that we leave understanding the significance of 2022 in what it has achieved in the last 10 years, in the same way we heard about shipping containers. So we have a series of questions, and I will start with you, Carla, if I may. The original objective, we heard some from Frank there around 2022. The mission, if you like, of the working group that was looking at 2022 at the time was to permit the migration of the securities industry to use 2002 and XML to guarantee interoperability across industry sectors, a bit like the multimodal type idea with containers, if you like. To what extent has it achieved that? Have we gone into a world now where 15022 is no longer relevant and 20022 is the dominant standard of choice?
No, that's not exactly what we see at this particular point, but we have had many successes in the adoption of ISO 20022 against some of the original vision that was to be delivered by ISO 20022. So in preparing for the panel, I went back to some of these tenets that are recorded on ISO20022.org, for example. So James already mentioned trying to be able to extend the standard to be a standard common approach across business domains, and not to rely on single standards for each business domain, allowing reuse of elements and components. So I think ISO 20022 has delivered on this vision in being able to deliver the repository, the process, and the recipe as a standard. I think that ISO 20022 also has fulfilled, from a technical perspective, an improvement over 15022, which is a standard, as we know, that's not based on OPA standards and technical forward-looking achievements. And that is still an obstacle that we need to be able to address, with ISO 15022 still having such an install base in our standards industry and in our financial industry. Where I have seen the improvement, though, is drawing new stakeholders to the standards world and increasing their focus on harmonization and standardization, which we haven't seen before. One of the things that ISO 20022 certainly has done is extended the conversation and extended the reach to new stakeholders and new parts of our business domain.
Carla, before you go, you don't get off the hook that easily. Well, as whenever you sit with your boss and they say, how has your year been, or how has your quarter been, and you give them all the good story, and then they say, but how could you have done better? Do you think there are obvious opportunities that we've missed with 2002 in achieving, well, we've achieved great successes, but could we have done more?
I think that we still have more to do, and yes, of course, we can do more. I remember back to the beginning of ISO 20022, and also when we were calling it 15022 Take Two, in effect. And at that particular point, I think that there was a vision of convergence. That word came up very, very much in the initial selling of ISO 20022 to SWIFT participants and to the industry as a whole. And convergence at that particular point in time was meant to encompass a standard to kind of end all standards, and also that focused on a syntax, a single syntax. And I think that our challenge still going forward for ISO 20022 is to realize the stakeholder base that we want to incorporate and include underneath the standard. And for us to keep in mind that we will have very, very few opportunities going forward to start with a blank sheet of paper. So our challenge is to continue to improve ISO 20022, both from a business standpoint and from a technical standpoint, to meet these integration challenges, to incorporate ISO 20022 into the business processes, systems, and businesses that our stakeholder base needs.
Thanks, Carla. Ray, from your end of the world and within Jazz Tech, users want a single standard. That's what we heard Carla say. I mean, she said it in very eloquent ways, but cutting it back to the basics, users want a single standard. Is that the view of JASTEC?
Single standard? Yeah, it's right. Generally speaking, negative impact should be taken for granted. That's where many standards exist in the same business field, I think. And ISO 20022 should be regarded as the convergence target, like the long-term and the ultimate goal. And ISO 20022 has taken a great and practical approach, which aims to pursue the efficient interoperability with the existing standards, like introduction of XML and reverse engineering. And these approaches are working very well. And JASTEC introduced ISO 20022 message standard in the field of post-trade and SNR this year. And we will also support the existing proprietary format and ISO 50022 message format until the end of 2018. And obviously, the supporting and maintaining multiple standards are very costly. I think messaging formats are kinds of communication tools like a language. And if multiple standards stand so many years, it would burden IT staff members and operational staff members. So, the important thing is this kind of heavy burden for operational staff should be taken should be regarded as one of the sunk costs for market players. I don't think it is IT matters. It is communication and business matters. And it's obvious that more and more market infrastructures are adapting to ISO 20022 recently. And especially some Asian market infrastructures skip ISO 50022 and jump in ISO 20022 directly. And however, I think each market players needs to address ISO 20022 migration more proactively, more strategically. And JASTEC also always expect Swift to play a significant role for both support and leadership for the industry.
Thanks, Ray. So I don't know about you, but I'm already beginning to hear a trend. So I heard from Carla that we've done some good stuff. We've come a long way, but there are those opportunities and challenges still remaining. Already Ray was mentioning it's the vision for convergence, the single language, but we'll take time to get there and there's a cost of achieving that. So perhaps we're setting a tone here. That's looking back. Now let's just think for a moment and look forward. 10 years ago, the world was, even in that short time scale, different. Neil, is it fit for purpose today? Is it going to face up to the challenges that we've got coming towards us 24/7? It's certainly something in our market that we talk about a lot in the payment sense. You know, is 20022 going to enable the real-time payments environment that we know that we will have to deliver for customers?
I mean, certainly from my side, I mean, sure, of course it will. But then there's part of me, James, that would turn around and say, MT messages could do that today. Things of technological advances with the infrastructure that supports SwiftNet Fin today would pretty much support that today anyway. The thing for me, the challenges outside of that aren't really within the syntax itself. To enable, as you quite rightly say, that in this day and age, payment systems are looking 24/7. They're looking faster payments. We've heard that on some of the sessions already today. But realistically, some of the challenges with that aren't ISO challenges. They're things around settlement. How do you actually settle a payment that's 24/7 when perhaps central bank accounts are actually only around? So there's the financial risk. Certainly with that side. So for me, the answer's yes, but then there's other things, and the environment we live in today can probably support that.
Roland, you and I have worked on this for many years. I do believe you were at the beginning of this too, like some of the others of us, Jamie included. So over that timescale, your views, is it good? Is it fit for purpose? Can you see it sticking with us for the next 10 years?
Well, when I heard the question, I was thinking to myself that there are two answers. One is a very short one, which is yes. The second one, a bit longer, maybe a bit more to the fit of the audience. I would turn the question around. Is the 24/7 world ready for ISO 20022? And I think that's exactly the case. I mean, as Neil said, the standard is complete, the standard is available, the standard is usable. It's a modern standard. We don't have, from my perspective, and I'm looking at it from a practical perspective, we don't have to do a big renovation of the standard. We don't have to do big maintenance. We have a modern thing for the industry, but if you look at the requirements Frank was talking about end-to-end, there are, from my perspective, a number of gaps in the end-to-end chain which need to be filled before this standard could be used in a 24/7 world.
Thanks, Roland. That's a key thought I'm sure we will continue to explore, because I personally couldn't agree with you more. So it seems that we agree that, yes, it will be around for another period to come, and it probably is the right base to continue to consolidate on, and the challenge is getting the right stakeholders around the table to do that. So are we convinced? Are we really convinced this is the right target for the industry? You know, I know personally at home I suffer with people asking me that question about, well, we're not sure whether 20022 is the right one. You know, maybe there will be 20023, or, you know, should we wait for that? I mean, personally, I'm convinced the momentum is there, but we should test ourselves to be sure of that. Siegfried, from your part of the market, is it clear?
Well, for T2S, I was confronted with this question, I think, already in 2008 or 2009. And it was really one of the first decisions taken by the new created governance body to decide that T2S can only be based on ISO 20 or 22. I was not so sure that all people and all parties being involved at this time really know what will be the challenges for the future and what does it mean. 15 or 22 was well established at this point in time. Some started to question why for securities business something else is needed. From today's perspective, I still would say yes, it was the right decision. It has given us a lot of flexibility explicitly for a new infrastructure which is going to be set up. It gave us the flexibility to adopt messages, to create new messages. So therefore, yes, I would say. And it's getting more and more visible and clear. It's not only for one business area. It is this issue that making use of ISO across different business areas. And I think that will be the challenge for the future. So, as said beforehand, still a clear yes, but there's, as always, also room for improvement.
That's very insightful. I heard a ignorance is bliss type comment about we didn't know what we were getting into at the time. So Stephen, Swift has been instrumental in this. Jamie was there at the start. You're the man on the spot now. We wouldn't be where we are today if Swift hadn't have put the resource into making us appreciate 20022 for all of its value. Was it the right choice, or was it equally a case that you didn't know what you were getting into? Was Frank the visionary that left with the vision, or are we good?
Yeah, I think he was. I mean, I think as we're going to explore further today, I think that not every single aspect of that vision was reached, but a lot was, and I think that we can all be very proud of that who've been involved in the process. You know, there's still more to do, and there are still parts of the vision that remain. Still just to be they're sketched in, but they're not filled in, and there's more work to be done there in particular. And coming back, I think one of the things that really is lacking is this notion of the standards as a hub, the 20022 dictionary as a hub for other standards to connect into, and to give us some sort of semantic equivalences between different messaging standards. The promise there is enormous, and we haven't really done the homework to get that done. But that doesn't take away from what has been achieved in any sense. I think that it really was the right decision, yes.
Good. So interoperability more than convergence?
I would argue yes.
Good. Excellent.
That's a very interesting point on which to pick up the next theme. Thank you very much, James. Can I take over now? Marvelous. One of the questions I'd really like to see on our board, though, is that critical question from Roland. Is the world ready? Is the 24/7 world ready for ISO 20022? I'm hoping we're going to get back to that. But let me move on to the next subject matter, the one which we want to evaluate 20022. It changed a lot, and it didn't just change the structure of the language in which we send each other messages. It changed the way in which we as a community define what kind of transactions we want to standardize and how to do so. Let me ask Jamie, actually, from your perspective, given what we know now, which of course we couldn't have known then, do you think we were asking to change maybe too much in one go?
No, I don't. I know that it's an expensive change for organizations, but I think that it was time, first of all, to have one standard for everybody, and that it was time to do that. But if I may just digress for one moment, I think we made at Swift a few, I'll call them mistakes, in the way we presented the standard to the community, which affected its take-up for several years. The first thing is we didn't really explain very well that it was syntax independent, that it was, what exactly was this new standard, that actually you could use it with any syntax. It was just once you had that model done, you were finished, okay? And if the model changed, it was changing because the business was changing, not because your syntax was changing. So that was number one. And we had to do a lot of backstepping and to explain that to the community. The second thing we did, I think, in retrospect, that we could have done a better job of is making sure that we had customer, not approval, but that the customers were behind us in putting this out there. Not only the customers, but other standards organizations. We found ourselves in the position where we were having almost every customer say, what? Whether they be securities, they're saying they had 15022, it's a new standard, why are you making us change? To the fin users who are, and I'm an original fin user myself coming from the banking side, we're very emotional about our standard. we don't want change. So that's what we were up against. And then number three, and then I'll finish with questions, sorry. The third thing I think that we did, that we could have done better was explain internally to Swift better what it was that we were trying to achieve. We found ourselves, standards people, which are typically analysts, and many of us are introverts, where we like to sit and talk to each other and get our jobs done. We found ourselves out there selling this standard instead of having the people in sales sell it, because they didn't necessarily understand what it was, and they didn't necessarily have the support of the people they needed the support of. So there were mistakes made along the way that, in retrospect, had we done a better job on those three things, I think we might not have had as much pushback from the community as we had. That's just my feelings on it.
Thank you. But in terms of the performance appraisal of 20022 itself, there's nothing wrong with 20022. It's just that maybe we didn't give it enough support in the job that it had
I think
to do.
ISO 20022 is fabulous because you literally can use it with any syntax. Okay, you build a model, and whatever the syntax you want to use, you can do it. And that's why eventually you had that standards coordination group come together and say, I can use it for fix, I can use it, this was of course on the security side, I can use it for any organization or any type of transaction.
Right. So let me ask you. I mean, I asked you to help with this. Do you think that ISO 20022 sells itself well enough? There's not a lot of raised hands. You do, sir. Excuse me, can we get a microphone to... It's right on its way. Thank you very much. Could you introduce yourself to everybody and then...
Yeah, Rich Urban with IFX Forum, a standards organization that contributes to the 20022 standard. And I really appreciate Jamie's remarks because I was one of the organizations that early on was having trouble figuring out where the 20022 standard fit vis-a-vis many other standards that are available in the world, and why did we need another one, and what was the genesis behind this. And I think one of the things, and I'll echo Jamie's comment, that could have been done better was recognizing, and I think to this day it's still a problem, that people look at the 20022 standard, they look at the messages in the repository and think of that as the standard, rather than the modeling techniques and the requirement techniques that the standard actually is much more robust around, and more, frankly, a better value to the rest of the financial services industry. When we get down to implementations, we all have technology constraints, we have product development constraints, we have vendor and software support constraints. But if we can model things the same way and understand how the interactions need to take place to accomplish business, which is where 20022 shines, I think Swift can still do a better job at that, because there still seems to be a bit of a focus on the nature of the messages rather than the modeling. And I think that's a really important piece of 20022 that needs to be reinforced.
It's very interesting that you say that, because a lot of people have the same sort of comment. ISO 20022 is something beautiful to people who get it, but there's a lot of people who don't quite get it. Roland, you got it. You got it pretty early on. Tell me what you think about this 20022 top-down modeling approach style appeals. What about that appealed to you?
First of all, I'd like to... First of all, I'd like to add to Jamie's comment. I think what happened when when Swift decided to move from 7775 to a new standard, to ISO 20022, there was something new which we were not aware of, and which we may have or should have been aware of. We came into competition with other standards developers, and to overcome this competitive idea, that took us quite some time, and this slowed down the whole process. That led to focusing on other issues instead of a proper marketing of the standard. So there are a couple of things which I would put into the box of lessons learned, which we would not do again if we thought about developing another standard after ISO 20022. Now, back to your question, I mean, I've been in this standardization since 1984, and I was actively participating in the 7775 development and so on and so forth. And I think what we did at that time, because that was a closed shop, more or less, it was Swift, and it was a financial community using Swift. We developed on request, we developed additional fields, we just looked at the standard. In ISO 20022, we've learned a lot, because we said the standard should not be driving the business should be driving the standard. So the people started to look at the model first. They looked on the top-down approach instead of the bottom-up approach. And it was important that you got more business people involved in the whole standardization process, because you need to understand the business, because otherwise you will have a standard at the end of the day that is not usable, because there is just IT people, standardizers involved, but not the business people. So I think the top-down approach is absolutely the right way to do it.
Let me bring in a different perspective here. Fiona and Wouter, you are innovators in the standards world. Your organizations manufacture and invent technology that makes standards-aware transactions easier to do. From your perspective, does the ISO 20022 methodology encourage such innovation with real business benefits at the end of it, or is it a hurdle to get across? Fiona?
To be honest, I kind of see it's a great idea, and it's more than just an academic process to do top-down modelling. I think it's the correct way to do a standard, to build that standard from scratch without having to just convert it from one pre-existing standard to another. However, I think that there's a huge difference between the development of the standard and the implementation of that standard. So, for example, I would say the vast majority of the projects and customers that we get involved with really are just interested in the artifacts which come out of that modelling process. They're by and large not even aware that there has been a modelling process to begin with. As far as they're concerned, it's an XML schema, and that's what they need to interact with. So I think there is a difference between whether people are paying attention to the modelling or not, and it's largely, I would say, the larger investment banks that we work with tend to get the modelling thing, because they have large teams of central architecture teams that understand UML, they understand the tools that arise from that, they understand the concepts of class diagrams and collaboration diagrams and sequence diagrams and all of those types of things. But for your average business analyst and somebody working on a project, those are utterly meaningless terms. And I think one of the barriers to kind of like pushing the whole modelling side of it is that a lot of that UML uses very technical, like W3C speak, and doesn't use actually business terminology. So I think it's a bit of a barrier to actually getting people to treat it as that.
Thank you. Wouter, you are also an innovator. Can I ask you the same question? Is this top-down modelling thing a hobby for top-level architects, but incomprehensible to the rest of us?
Well, I think that the top-down approach, starting at the conceptual level and translating that in more technical terminology in a layered approach, it helps us as a technology provider. It helps us in swiftly implementing those new versions of the standard, and in coming to a higher productivity in getting our tools to the market. So that is absolutely the case, yes.
Okay. And anybody who wants to see what you're doing with this technology, come and visit the stands, right?
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but you might as well. Okay. What I want to do now is hand back to James for the next set of performance appraisals. Is that okay, James? Wonderful.
So one of the things that Frank made a reference to was the heart of the standard. And if you remember, he said the heart of the standard was this repository, the store where you put all the bits of information that you've spent so long collecting, analysing and documenting in a rigorous way. Do we believe that? I mean, we seem to have heard different view, that some people think that it's the messages that you get out that are important. Some people seem to think that it's that process you go through, the rigour of that's important. Frank was saying it's the repository at the centre. We heard Roland say earlier the top-down approach really mattered. So it almost is beginning to feel a bit like we all see different dimensions of the same issue, and it's very unlike the container up there where you can see it and visualise it. Maybe that is part of the problem with 20022, that people don't see it all clearly. So this repository where we store all this information and you can now access it in a much more open manner than was ever the case before, and certainly not at the early days of the vision. So the power of that repository panel. Jamie.
I think that the repository is what's the difference between the business side of that standard and the technical side that you were talking about, Fiona. The average business person doesn't need to know and shouldn't care about what my model looks like, as long as what comes out meets their expectations and that they can do their business in an easy way. So this, for me, the repository is one of the most important aspects from a business standpoint. It's without the business people, you wouldn't have a repository.
But maybe in just taking what you said there, and I like that because it's a good way of looking at it, maybe that means, you know, it is perhaps the place that we should begin to describe what it is that 20022 is. It's a collection of, you know, explanations and logic that is captured from a business user that a technologist can then go and implement. As Fiona said, you know, implementation is very different from that process. So maybe that's how we should explain it.
And maybe I'll follow that thought with, that's going to be the link between your payments and your securities and your foreign exchange and all of your other different types of businesses, because people can understand that. And that can be added to the repository if it's not already in there.
Absolutely. The reusable aspect.
Yes.
Neil, from a practitioner's point of view, do you agree? Does a repository make sense to you as a business user, that it exists as this sort of level of mediation between all these technologists?
Well, certainly from a business standpoint, yes, I think that's the answer. It's the repository is an enabler. But to be controversial, I mean, is the repository the thing that's going to drive this forward? In my opinion, no. You're still missing a major mix, and that's the catalyst. What is going to really push things forward? Because that, to me, I think that the conclusion I'm hearing from the panel and hopefully the wider concept is that it's there. It's fit for purpose. We're just missing that one thing to spark the drive forward and to see things being adopted and pushing forward to implement the standard. Certainly, as you say, the actual repository itself is the tools that we need to push this on, but we need the thing that's going to start it.
Okay. Hans, from your point of view, I'm very interested in your view on this, because you're a very well-known mass adopter of 20022. So are you the one who's providing us the drive, as Neil referred to?
Well, I should say yes. So,
you're welcome to.
So I think I think it's mentioned several times that the driver is to make clear to the user of the standard, because without knowing that they are a user of the standard. So that's one thing. So the business driver is mentioned very often. So if we can make clear to them that we can that they save cost, energy, and time by implementing a standard, and that they have a more secure business process going on. That there are a lot of securities are built in, so that there are a lot of things are taken care of that they don't have to take care of, but are, let's say, more within the standards. And if we can get that message across, and we can use the standard, let's say, in a bank-to-bank environment, but also within the bank, to interconnect all the different business capabilities, let's say at the same level or with the same robustness, then it would sell itself. It would sell itself. So, and then the repository is just a tool, is just the catalog, it's just the glossy brochure to give people access and raise their appetite. But then it should be, we should explain what the great advantages are for them, what's in it for them if they use it, and then it's a no-brainer.
Thanks. So one thing that always troubles me, and we heard a bit from Frank of the vision originally 10 years ago that this was going to be the standard to which everybody would flock, and it would rule the world, if you like. And I think we've realized that it's slightly different than that. We've heard about interoperability. We've heard about allowing people to have time to invest, as Ray was saying, and see that payback over time. Are we sure that 20022 has enough flexibility to capture everybody's requirements and still allow them to differentiate themselves? So is it an enabler of competition? Market practices? Are we doing well with market practices, or are they in fact eroding some of that value? Carla.
I guess we heard a bit about that at for those of you who attended the Payment Market Practice Group meeting this morning. And we had a healthy dose of that last week when the Securities Market Practice Group met here in Boston as well. So we say that standards are supposed to reflect business requirements. And there'll always be a measure of business requirements that can be harmonized. There always will be a measure of business requirements that people can agree on. But there will, unless unless something radically changes, there always will be room for a business requirement to differ from country to country, region to region, business domain to business domain. And what we need to continue to strive to is to look for the similarities rather than the differences, and to cut down on those, but not to overlook them. Because some of the things that I remember in the standard were unusual or unique are now common business practice, and that's how we learn from each other.
Good, good. And Fiona, you made a comment, and Walter, I'd be interested in your point of view on that too, about the difference between the business layer and the repository, messages and implementation. So do we need market practices, and does 20022 need to embrace those variants, or is that just simply a point of implementation and that's where you build that detail in? Do we need to roll that up into the repository?
I think, actually, just going back to the repository point, it's interesting that I went through an exercise a couple of months ago, actually. Volante, as well as being in receipt of message standards at the implementation side, we also actively contribute to a couple of standards bodies. So one was BTRS, and one's CGI, Common Global Implementation - Market Practice, as it now is. And we actually had to go through an exercise of actually trying to not reinvent the wheel. So let's see what's in the repository that we can reuse within those standards. And actually, one of the biggest drawbacks, I think, about the adoption of the repository is it's really not easy to use. You know, it's very difficult when you're just thinking, I want to find something which is an account type thing. Yeah, you can find it, but it's not intuitive. You know, you can't kind of like look at a landscape of business functions. So I think, you know, that's important. The ISO 20022, the artifacts, the message schemas, I think almost their flexibility has become almost a downside, because people have really embraced the in XML, extensible. So therefore, obviously, a lot of work over the last 10 years has gone into, you know, the underlying message standards, and especially I think where the real success we've seen out of those 60, 70 markets that are going to adopt it. Obviously, Target 2 securities is an exception, and corporate actions in certain places as well. But largely speaking, a lot of that I think is driven by domestic payments infrastructures adopting 20022. And obviously, when you look at that, yeah, the PACS and PAIN messages are, I think, being acknowledged as a great starting point. But then, you know, the market practices for, you know, the particular domestic infrastructures, or indeed between the corporate to bank space. So, you know, we've spent a lot of time creating CGI messages, but then they're slightly different than the SEPA messages, and then you have the AOS versions of SEPA, and they're all based on the same thing. And actually, you know, Swift as well are, you know, sometimes using a different version. So, I mean, we have a matrix which shows the ISO published standard, the Swift user handbook published standard for ISO 20022, and the Swift solution, so where you bundle things together. And quite often there's 3 different versions or variants used across of those. And you have to, I mean, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but we have to acknowledge that an ISO registration process is always, by definition, going to lag behind the real-world pressures of implementing a new service, a solution, a commercial proposition, etc. So, you know, it's always going to be, I think, just viewed as that's the basis, but we have to find a way to support and acknowledge the fact that every country is going to be slightly different. Each market segment is going to be slightly different.
If I may, I think that's a very interesting point, because I think we need to be clear about the value of engaging in that process. So there's a level of engagement that you say, absolutely, we want to define something, it's a brand new process, or it's a brand new process to 20022, so let's, you know, put the effort in and describe it. And then, you know, you get a momentum behind that, but you've got to be clear why you're doing it, because it's not something that's done lightly. It involves, you know, considerable effort. And as communities adopt 20022 and it becomes more and more successful, I think we need to look. I mean, that's a challenge to us for the future. I think we need to look how we are embracing those communities and their adoption, and making sure, as I think as you were saying, Carla, and you were very much picking up on that, Fiona. We can reflect the rich variety that exists under that level where we've all been able to agree, because that's a reflection on the reality of the very many markets that will adopt 20022 and are in the process of adopting it. So that's back to this interoperability point of yours, I would say, Jamie, and the repository at the centre of that.
Is it on?
Yep.
If I want to just go back to your other question, and then I'll respond to that. You asked earlier if the ISO 20022 was an enabler of competition. That was the first part of the question. And I'm sorry, Carla, but I didn't hear you respond to that, so I'd like to respond to it. I would think it's a disabler of competition, not an enabler of competition from a standard standpoint, which is all it is. It's a standard. Because it enables anybody to use whatever their syntax is. Okay, so I'll put that behind us. I also attended PMPG parts of it this morning, and it was interesting. I took a couple of notes. Somebody said, and I think that they were right. They were talking about the fact that you need to map and use it with consistency, and I think that's part of what you were bringing up, Fiona. That is something that's not necessarily taking place today. Part of it because of the speed of change, and part of it because organizations naturally try to do things their own way. That's how we got in some of the messes we were in Fin several years, many years ago, when there were so many changes taking place. Same with ISO 15022, where we had to make changes because market practices made it necessary for us to change the way it was originally designed. All right. And the last thing that was said this morning that I found interesting is again, that we have to take the corporates into account, and that goes to what Frank was saying, the end-to-end processing. I'm not sure the corporates I know they weren't involved in the development per se, but how far are they developed, are they involved today? Because if you don't get that, and the corporates demand that you use, very often will demand that a bank use its standard, or whatever it is they're using, and how do we get around that?
Just before I go to Walter, because I see that he wanted to comment, I think we need to be really clear to your point, Jamie, about standards as an enabler and competition versus collaboration. To me, standards are a real success story in our industry about how competitors collaborate, but it doesn't mean that they can't commercially differentiate themselves off of those standards. And there's a boundary there, and I would never want to stand here and go leave that point unchallenged, because I think we need to be really clear to everyone in the industry that standards are very, very powerful and a powerful, network public good in many respects. But it allows businesses to offer value to customers off the back of those standards, and that sometimes, and I think that's a challenge we have for the future, is how do we ensure that we get the right level of documentation about what are being implemented, to Fiona's point, flowing back into the centre. And that's Neil's point too, because in reality, you want to make sure that people are engaged, they're seeing the uplift. The uplift is the real uplift, not just the ones who have bothered to come back to ISO to explain themselves. So there's a challenge in there. I know Walter wanted to react, so.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to say something. I heard people talking about variations, and a lot of variations and consistency of the standard. I also heard things said about change and the standard's capability to react to change sufficiently fast. And I think that we could invert the question and say, is it possible to capture the reality of an industry in a single, rigid, versionless standard? And I think the answer is clear. It is not possible to do that. But if there's one thing that I've learned from IT and doing standards and doing software in the financial context, is that rather than resisting to change, you should recognize that change is a part of reality, and that you should embrace change in your process. And I think that brings us back to the point of what is exactly what was the original objective of the ISO 20022 standardization is not only to define a standard for the financial industry, but also to propose a process for developing standards for the entire community, And I think that is an important ingredient for being successful in a world that is evolving dynamically, that is innovating, and that's driven by requirements or competition. That's an important element.
Thank you very much. Andrew, let me invite you back, and we will...
Thank you very much. I think I'm very conscious that we are, and our performance appraisal is kind of standing in between you and a huge variety of interesting cocktail parties. So I just want to try and summarize, if I may, what I think we've heard, which is that ISO 20022 actually has performed very well as such. What we now need to do to it in order to help it perform even better in the future is really what I think you've been talking more about than anything else over the last 45 minutes. And that is that we need to make it more consumable. We need to make it more easily adoptable in that end-to-end space that actually all of you and Joanna Yates and Frank van Dam mentioned, addressing the gaps that some of you have referred to, both in the end-to-end space and in the way in which it can be adopted. One of the things that I'm hoping we're all going to have the opportunity to work on this week is how our standards and our standardization activities can be enriched and can then enrich interoperability with some of the newer transaction models out there. We're having a session here on cryptocurrency. We're having a session here on semantics, and all of these things will, of course, be conducted with experts from those worlds with whom we really want to work over the coming months. So with that very solid A-star rating for 20022 and a very clear call to action to make it more inclusive, more usable, more directly adoptable, not only by the community who still has yet to really get behind it in here, but the communities beyond the current community. I think, is that a reasonable summary of where we are? That's good. Thank you very much indeed, panel and audience. I wish you a really good Sibos and especially a brilliant Standards Forum. Thank you very much indeed.